Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session, our book forum session with Paola Rivetti. I'm just going to go slow in the first minute to allow folks to sign on. So as people are coming on, I'm just really quickly going to talk about the upcoming events we have before I turn our attention to our event today and our esteemed speaker. So for next week, next Wednesday, March 24th, we have a fireside chat with Professor Vadi Nast and Senator Chris Murphy. They'll be talking about Iran-US relations. And after that, on April 8th, we have another fireside chat on US-Iran relations between Professor Nast and Representative Ro-Khanna. And we'll have our final book forum session in April. You can check on our website, which will be with the political scientist Eric Loeb on his new book on the reproduction jihad. So those are some of our upcoming events. We also, starting next week, will have a new series of reports coming out from social scientists looking at Iran under sanctions as a part of our larger Iran under sanctions project for this academic year. So those projects and those reports, they're all based on original research, looking at the different ways in which sanctions have impacted social dynamics in Iran and political dynamics in the country. So we'll start releasing those next week, and there will be some public programming around those as well. So without further ado, I'm really excited to have with us today for our book forum, Dr. Paola Rivetti. Dr. Rivetti is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Dublin University in Ireland, Dublin City University in Ireland, excuse me. She was awarded the 2018 Early Career Researcher of the Year Prize by the Irish Research Council. And in 2018, she also received the Dublin City University President's Award for Early Career Research. Paola Rivetti's book that we'll be discussing today was just published in 2020, and it's called Political Participation in Iran from Khatami to the Green Movement. It examines the unintended consequences of top-down reforms in Iran, analyzing how the Iranian reformist governments between 1997 and 2005 sought to utilize gradual reforms to control independent activism, and how citizens responded to such disciplinary action. I'm really thrilled to have her here with us today. We're going to be having a conversation about her work, about her research, and sort of what we can learn about the reform movement and importantly, the activism of that time period and what it means having gone forward since the Green Movement period to today. So first, I want to really welcome Paola to here. I wish we were in person, but welcome to the world of Zoom and YouTube.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Narges.
Yeah, of course. And actually, we were just talking before we started the live stream that we first met in Tehran about 16 years ago. I think during Paola's first visit to Iran. And so it's incredible to sort of come full circle with the publication of the book and see where that research has led her and where it's gone. And I really want to say this to folks who are watching. This is a really, first of all, extremely clearly written book. It really captures the complexities of the reformist time period in Iran and student activism and social and activism more generally in civil society circles. And as I told Paola before we came on, I already added it to my syllabus. I think it's a really great book to teach with. And so first, I just really want to congratulate you on the publication of the book and on the book just being so well done.
Thank you so much. This is really generous of you. And it's, I mean, I agree. It's very nice to be, to be here 16 years after that day in 2005. And I also share the feeling of coming full circle. It's very nice, actually.
Yeah. So for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I want you to sort of give folks an understanding of what it is that you wrote about in this book. And then from there, I really want to get into why you chose this topic, what sort of led you to wanting to write about the topics that you do end up writing about in your book.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, all scholars have a kind of personal story behind why they got interested in, you know, such and such topic. And of course, I have mine as well. And I think it's very much connected. It really relates to a certain way of thinking about politics and also doing politics that was quite hegemonic in, you know, late 90s, you know, and the 2000s. I'm nearly 40 years of age. So that's when, roughly speaking, that's when I was, you know, 20 years old, and I kind of moved on from high school to university. So that in that period there was also 9/11, which of course you know, introduced, or better imposed on public discourse and public debates in almost every country in the world. Certainly that was the case in Italy, where I studied, by the way, and where I'm talking to you from today. You know, this topic of Islam, and it was kind of the first time, you know, that Islam really became central to public debates. And of course, Islam became central in a very specific way, because of course it was tied to discussions about violence, tied to discussion about, you know, is it democratic, is it not democratic? One of the most important questions that were really structuring public debates, but also academic debates and the scholarship within academia back then was, is Islam compatible with democracy, with liberal democracy? And then, is Islam compatible with human rights, and so forth and so on? And it all, you know, was about this idea that perhaps 9/11 and perhaps Al-Qaeda were not, you know, were not surprising, because there's something inherent about Islam that is, you know, undemocratic, violent, and so forth and so on. And of course, I was confronted with these questions as well. And I remember I took my first ever course about history, and in Italian, it's called History and Institutions of the Muslim World. That's basically Middle East politics, but it was this 90-hour long module, which we used to have, back then in Italian universities. So you really go through, everything, and you have time to discuss and analyze all sorts of issues and so forth and so on. So I became more and more interested. And reformism was very much, or at least to me, looked very much like the answer to this question of, are democracy and Islam compatible? And, what was back then called Islamic reformism looked like the answer to this question. And the question was basically, yes, they are compatible. In fact, Islamic reformism is proposing a different interpretation of Islam, a different perspective on Islam, a perspective which is more democratic, which kind of upholds the idea and the idea that Islam is in fact compatible with human rights and democracy. So I became more and more interested in reformism because of that. And I think, going back to, this kind of general, politically speaking, general atmosphere that I think was hegemonic in the 90s and 2000s, certainly was so in Italy. Reformism, the discourse of even somebody like Mohammad Khatami, who, if you want, was the symbol or the leader of the Iranian reformist movement, was very much fitting with the favor that reformism was, not Islamic, not religious reformism, but generally speaking, political reformism, that reformism was encountering in places like Italy. In the 2000s, we're still in that kind of, long wave of disillusion with socialism, disillusion with all sorts of leftist, ideology. And of course, this comes from, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in a country like Italy, this was really a major disruption of, of political life. So I was seeing, these connections between this discourse, this Islamic reformism that was very much attracting my attention, but that at the same time, this Islamic reformism had so many resonances with all that was discussed and all that was said in Italy about reformism and the fact that all political forces in Italy were looking at reformism as the answer, because we are in, back then we thought we were in this kind of post-ideological phase and, kind of post-leftist politics, because, socialism didn't work out. So we had to find something else. And socialism was thought to be, the right answer to this kind of soul searching that the leftist and center left in Italy embarked on in those years. So that's how I got interested in reformism. And as I started reading about it, as I started also reading primary sources, especially when it comes to Iranian reformism and Khatami, because back then, there was a lot of attention on Iran, and it was a positive attention back then. It was not about, there were of course discussions about, the nuclear program, but there was also with Khatami, Italian journalists were actually traveling to Iran, were writing about, the women's movement, were writing about civil society, were writing about, about so many different topics. And Khatami actually, had this special connection to Italy. Italy was the first country he visited in his capacity as president of the Republic. His daughter studied in Italy, so there was a connection there. And therefore, many of his speeches were translated. It was quite common to read about, about Khatami and about Iranian politics in Italian newspapers, which, by the way, is not the case anymore today. So I got, I just saw this, actually there was a lot of material just out there for me to, to just read and just take and analyze. So that's how I got interested. And as I moved on and decided, okay, this is what I want to study. And then I traveled to Iran for the first time, 16 years ago in 2005, and then, going back and forth since then. Of course, my perspective on reformism changed because I was able to see all the limitations, and in particular, and I think this is, the core argument, or that the core topic, and also, to a certain extent, the core argument of the book. One of the limitations was this, was the mismatch of expectations that people and specifically kind of younger activists in student activists, so activists in universities, but broadly speaking civil society, had of reformism and the promise of change that Khatami made to the larger population. And on the one side, and on the other side, actually, what first of all Khatami was able to deliver, because of course his, he possibly was genuinely committed to deliver change, but there were more powerful, forces than him that didn't agree on that. But also, I think the fact that reformism and Khatami's government in particular were very much exploiting, possibly, the discourse of change to harvest popular support, perhaps without the actual intention to meet the expectation of the population. So when I kind of realized that, it gave me a very different perspective on reformism. So I kind of transitioned from, thinking of reformism as this sort of, very nice and very consistent as well, discourse and policy actions, and, they were in government, they were in power, they were going to deliver change. So from thinking of reformism as this consistent political project to think of reformism as a very much contested political project where, where people, activists, civil society activists, but also ordinary people actually had a lot of reasons to be unhappy and to be, angry, if you want, at their government.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mention in the book is that you say reformism was not only about political liberty, but it was also a project of social engineering to foster political participation to reinforce the legitimacy of the government. So you sort of lay out in your book the ways in which more conservative forces within the establishment of the Islamic Republic began to sideline after the war the Islamic left, and how that sidelining of the Islamic left meets with, in essence, the activism of not only just women's different forms of women's movements for activism, but also student movements within the university spaces. And you spend quite a bit of time on the importance of the university spaces for activism in Iran, and the marriage of these forces coming together for the election of Khatami. And as you were just mentioning, then the necessity of him and his government to manage those expectations and all of the disappointments that come after that of, you're just utilizing the energy, you're not actually coming out and doing what you need to be that needs to be done. And so I want you to talk a little bit. I'm really interested in sort of this notion of the social engineering from the political establishment and or parts of it and the different ways it sort of manifested itself, because you're also really careful in your descriptions to talk about how there none of this is monolithic, and there was lots of different competing factions and all of that. But also what you do in this book is it's really grounded in a lot of field work, and you make it very clear that what you were trying to do is to center the story of reformism in Iran, not just on what was happening on a macro political level, but on the activists themselves. And you start out the book with stories of activism. And so just first, I'd love to hear a little bit about your methodology in doing this, and then the ways in which, you just described to us how you came to this project as a intellectual and political project, but then what interacting with the activists and doing field work with them, and especially in the university spaces and outside, what that taught you about the limitations of this project and sort of what they were advocating for.
Yeah, definitely. And the encounter with people on the ground was at the same, was at once really, really difficult for me because they were saying different things from the things I was expecting them to say. So I was really, lost and disoriented. But of course, at the same time, this was really enlightening because at a certain point, I started processing, this kind of dissonant information that I was, or dissonant, interviews and information and data I was collecting and asking why was that so, so dissonant. So definitely fieldwork is, for me, has been the starting point. As you said, I came to this topic with as you said, an intellectual intention and intentionality, which was not, I've never thought, and I think this is really important, I never thought of Iran as a sort of insular, as an island where things happen but have no resonances, no correspondence to things that happens somewhere else in the world. And, reformism was actually a very good way for me to think multilaterally, about politics between Iran and Italy, played a very important role, although of course it's not in the book and it's not in the research. But yeah, when I went to Iran, so I moved from this kind of more abstract intellectual level to the kind of, fieldwork level. So I kept on, meeting, especially at the beginning was especially student activists. And they were basically telling me, what I thought was an extremely inconsistent story about how good it was that, Khatami was there and how important it was and how, and how hopeful they were for the future. But at the same time, they were also telling a story of deep discontent, of, frustration, of being angry at Khatami. And, and I spent a lot of time thinking about why that was the case, and what was the kind of point of contestation, kind of point of conflictuality that made these testimonies so strange for me. And I think that was precisely, I mean, it wasn't only about the fact that expectations were not met. So the expectations of change that, of course, activists had were simply not met by the government, but was also because of the way in which I was thinking of reformism, and possibly they were also thinking of reformism as an innocent political project, as something that we can define as good and as that has good intention, which something that doesn't have an agenda or a hidden agenda. I mean, I'm not sure this is the right phrase, but something that is intentionally innocent, which of course reformism was not. Reformism was an operation or a project of political engineering, thinking that reformism was all about liberties and freedoms and civil society, and they were such a great speakers and people with such a I'm thinking of Khatami, but not exclusively of Khatami, of many of the people he had around himself, were they had charisma, they had intellectual depth. They were those who made the revolution, and they were those who, for instance, within the circles of student activists, still enjoyed a lot of political credibility, because it was them who, 20 years earlier or 30 years earlier were in the universities doing political activism, exactly, as 30 years later were doing the people I was talking to. So there was this, there was this status of credibility, of political political ability as well, that all these the reformist class had. But they were not innocent. They were there to push a specific agenda, and basically, when it comes to political participation, the agenda they had basically was saying to activists, do organize, do take over these spaces for political participation that we are opening for you through the discourse of civil society, through this push that was there in Iran since mid-late 90s, of establishing NGOs and establishing different what we call civil society organizations. So do activate on that ground. We are preparing it for you, but be careful, because this is not, because we don't want you to activate in whatever form you want. We want you to activate in the way we are telling you to become active and to participate politically, which of course didn't happen, because as political participation was encouraged and was incentivized, people activated politically, more or less like they wanted. And that's where the political exclusion of two, fringes that were too radicals, even political repression of, some protests, political, or, judiciary persecution of specific, individuals or specific segments or specific groups was availed by the government. So that's where the political engineering part kicks in, because that political participation that Khatami and others were all the time talking about, actually was, it wasn't innocent. They had they wanted people to activate in a specific way. And of course, people didn't. So that's the kind of approach. So moving from thinking of political reformism and Khatamism as a sort of innocent, political project, to thinking of it as a social and political engineering. That's where that's when I shifted my perspective from A to B, that's when I was able to understand why people were telling me stories that to my first impression were inconsistent, and I couldn't kind of match them with that's a frustration that was was coming out of many. I would say every every encounter I had with activists, and and of course this frustration was creating something that I call a surplus of activism, because people were asked to activate politically, but then if they didn't fit the model, if you want, then they were excluded. So there was a certain amount of political hope, of determination to activate politically that was structurally excluded because it didn't fit this political engineering project that the reformists had. And I argue that that surplus of activism was actually really important, because that's the kind of how can I say, the kind of origin, or the kind of the field where the political determination that was necessary for 10 years later the emergence of the Green Movement was stored and was kept and was kind of stored for for the future. So, and this kind of, I mean, my analysis, of course, is kind of crosses different eras, if you want, because we're talking about Khatamism and Khatami's reformism, so late 90s, mid 2000. But I also talk about what is between 2005 and 2009, 2010, when the Green Movement erupted and emerged. And I would have not been able to do so if I didn't go back and forth between Iran and Italy before, and then Iran and Ireland when I moved to Ireland, and therefore fieldwork was really important, because it was a constant revision of what I was thinking, a constant revision of my analysis, a constant revision of literally my understanding of things. And therefore methodology was really important, because that's the process through which you basically I that's, for me at least, is valid, how I made all these revisions, these subsequent revisions. So I was meeting people, I was interviewing them, but I also did a lot of what is usually called participant observation. So I, for most part of my time, I hanged out with with people. I hanged out with them. I used to go to to places. Of course, university campuses, different university campuses, but also parties, any situation where I could kind of fit in. I took that opportunity, with great enthusiasm. But I also used some, written sources. So, access to archives, and I guess you know that very well, access to archives in Iran is, it's not easy. So the only archive I was able to access was the parliamentary archive. And I think I ended up in some strange situation where, where actually you're doing something that nobody wants you to do, but for some for some accidental things that happen, you end up actually having access to that place. So I remember I was able to go there for quite an extended time, because I worked in the archives for, I think it was like 3 months. So, but I knew that probably, there was the first and the last time I was given access to those. So I basically spent there all my time for those 3 months. I did try to access the National Archives, and it was just impossible. So I asked if I could, work with newspapers and the newspapers collection at the National Library. And, I was not given permission, but I remember that I had to have lunch for 1 week every day with, different people who were working in the, management of the library. So every day I was there asking if, please, I could work and, with the newspaper collection, and, it was always lunchtime. So I had to have lunch with them. And I was really hoping that after 1 week of, having lunch with them, I was eventually, but I wasn't. So I couldn't work with them with the, the newspaper collection at the library. But I was given access to the collection of newspapers in English. So not great, but in fact, they were helpful for some very preliminary, preliminary work. But of course, they didn't do much of, the core work. Of course, wasn't on those. And then I was working with magazines, and magazines where reformists or allies of the reformists were publishing and writing. So that was actually very important for me, because I was able to get their views, from the articles I was reading and translating. And I, just very briefly, I really want to add that, my Persian is okay, but I wasn't definitely able to read. I wasn't able at all to read and translate by myself long articles, with political analysis and so forth and so on. So I was helped by, by great people in Iran who were, spending time with me, reading the articles and then translating them and then discussing them, which was also really, really important. So I have learned a lot from working with people in the country, and I have taken a lot from them as well.
So in your, I also just want to remind the viewers on various platforms that we're streaming on that feel free to post in your questions on whatever platform you're viewing or on social media, and we'll then read those back to Paula in a little bit. But please do post any questions you all have. Paula, I wanted to talk with you about, so what you were just discussing before was the status sort of expectations of those who came into reformism through electoral politics, because at the end of the day, were still being elected to a system that was about preserving that revolutionary system in this moment in time. And there was a lot of, I want to get back to the disappointment from within activists, but before I do, the extreme amounts of pressure that were put on even the elected officials from the conservative end. So you talk about the seeming innocence of this political project, especially at the beginning, and the ways in which it seems like folks who were voting in the elections, folks maybe younger activists at the time, but very quickly, especially in the first sort of term of Khatami's, and very much so in the second term of Khatami's presidency, it became very, very clear all of the political pressure that was being put on to reformism, whether in formal politics or on the street level, wherever it was from the more conservative end of the political spectrum. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your thoughts about this struggle that we then sort of see explode in the later points, which we'll get to in a second. But what that and what that was sort of telling you, and how it was that activists were learning in the process of responding to this kind of pressure, against those movements that were happening at the time.
Yeah, so definitely the second, as you said, Narges, the second presidential term of Khatami was a different story, if you want, from the first one, and a much less hopeful story, if you want, because it became clear that it became clear what the balance of power was, and that balance of power was in favor of non-reformist and let's call them conservative forces, but those forces that were somewhat against the governmental plans for reform. And this was very important. This was if you want, a kind of wake-up call for many activists as well. I have worked specifically with, not exclusively, but I've done a lot of work with student activists. And student activists were very interesting for me because, well, first of all, because I was a student as well. So there was this kind of connection that I felt very strongly, extremely strongly. And now that I grew up and I'm still in contact with some of them, it's a little bit like what I felt when yesterday I thought about our first, I recalled our first meeting. I have that kind of tenderness, if you want, that that I feel. But yeah, student activists were very interesting because they were, if you want, a good symbol of this, a good symbol of how a historically and politically strong and important and highly regarded political movement, like the student movement, like some of the organizations that were kind of structuring activism on the different campuses of universities in Iran, was in a way pervaded by this sense of frustration, and was in a way kind of woke up to to this reality of this extreme imbalance of power. And I'm saying this because the student movement, all the student activists had really within themselves this feeling of being important, this knowledge, this awareness of being important and coming from such an important political story. And therefore, it was really difficult for them to recognize that, this time they were not making a difference. This time they were not, they were not making, things were not going like they wanted, because other forces were more powerful, because, and those forces didn't really care about their glorious past. So the frustration within the networks of student activists was really, really strong. And there was also this very interesting contrast, if you want, between, on the one side, being so reluctant to engage with something different that was then student politics and university politics, because that was where, that was the terrain where they felt strong, they felt self-confident, and so forth and so on. But on the other side, the political awareness and the kind of, the awareness that that was not a winning strategy. And therefore you had this, younger, if you want, student activists who were already starting to reach out to non-university, non-academic groups, such as, the larger, what is called the women's movement, in different organizations within that, or trade unions, specific, and in particular the teachers and the bus drivers that back then were, were able to kind of do some political work and, strikes and some political organizing, and students were really suffering because they had this very hard time to reconcile this sense of self-confidence, and they knew they were coming from literally a glorious political story, but at the same time, as you said, becoming aware of the fact that things were not going well. And interestingly enough, this didn't translate into more internal solidarity within, the larger, how can I say, the larger framework of the reformist movement. The fact that different reformist groups or civil society organizations were actually realizing that things were not going well didn't create more solidarity. Actually, I think created more fragmentation.
Yeah, I mean, I want to move us into the Ahmadinejad period and then the rise of the Green Movement. And the interesting thing from what you lay out in your book and what you're talking about right now is how even among the reformists, especially those within the political establishment, there was a constant, as you talked about a little bit before, a constant push to narrow the scope of demands, narrow the type of political engagement, narrow the radicalism, narrow the energy and the demands that were being made. And then Ahmadinejad comes into power. The reformists come under attack, and especially after the 2009 period, and you have the same tactics and the same ways in which the reformists consistently asked activists to narrow their demands and to, support us, but be quiet and let us do our thing. We know what's best. You sort of then begin to have the flip of that, and it's the reformists who are on the receiving end of that kind of rhetoric then. And it becomes this really, I think, and by the point that begins to happen, because of that lack of solidarity that you just talked about, that didn't take form, it begins to really fragment in this post sort of 2009 period. But you mentioned something in your book that by the time Ahmadinejad gets elected, and then there is, especially from 2005 to 2009, a push to marginalize reformism and activism of all sorts across different forms of civil society in Iran, that although it seemed like the political project of reformism was under attack, but the experiences and the knowledge and the expectations that people had gained in that 8-year period, that did not die out. And so, you are really conscious in the book of talking about how this is a period of, and this is a story about not just reformism as a political movement or something within the state, but really much larger about political hope and the desire among activists to keep political hope alive, even in front of disappointment after disappointment from their perspective and from where they were standing politically. So I would just love, what is that? How did that play out in the Ahmadinejad period? But really importantly, like, how does it then manifest itself? Because the Green Movement starts again with like this very electoral demand of where's my vote, and quickly goes into the radicalism of down with the dictator and questioning the system as a whole. And that, of course, does not come from it doesn't come from out of nowhere. It comes from this longer trajectory that you're painting for us in this book.
Yeah, I couldn't say, I mean, you said it in the best way possible. Definitely, that was exactly my, and there are so many, I recall so many examples of what people said to me that were really encapsulating this, the fact that during the first period, the first presidency of Ahmadinejad, 2005, 2009, the legacy of, the fact that the reformist governments were asking of people to activate politically, was a legacy of fragmented activism, but extremely lively. I do remember, for instance, some of the activists of the 1 million signature campaign who were, they were telling me stories about, about how they used to collect signatures. So of course you had, those who were ringing the bell of their neighbors and, talking to the neighbors. But there was this very nice story of an activist who used to go to the barracks of the Basij. And, she was so brave, and while she was telling me this story, she was saying, I felt invincible. Like I felt so brave and so invincible that I didn't care. I wasn't scared of, going to the barracks of Basij and asking them to sign our petition for, pro-women legislation. So this is just one example, but I do remember as well, because actually this is when, this is the period I started doing my fieldwork, because the first time I was in Iran was the summer of 2005. So actually, and I remember watching on the TV the very moment when Khatami and Ahmadinejad went to basically receive the nomination as the new president of the republic. And I remember watching that. So I recall going to NGO offices, also newspapers, but mostly NGO offices, that this feeling was very prevalent there. And the feeling was I found in those offices was a feeling of of thinking, yeah, this guy, that was elected president of the republic, it's so silly, there was this constant, people were constantly telling me and using this phrase that was collective intelligence or civil intelligence. And there was this idea, and this notion was told me a number of times, that that collective intelligence, civil intelligence, was too forward now. So this guy might have become the new president of the republic, but we're not scared. He won't be able to change things. So there was really this sense of empowerment, and definitely that is a legacy of the of the reformist period. So in that sense, yes, you really nailed it. The history of Iranian reformism in that period, so Khatami and Green movement, is not a history of high politics, of institutions, of there is that, of course, there is that, but it is very much a history of people. It is very much about political hope and the kind of and the feeling of empowerment that Iranian reformism, I don't think Iranian reformism was transmitting to ordinary citizens and, broadly speaking, activists and the citizenry. I think the citizenry already is what originated Iranian reformism, but of course it's a complex relationship, but it is a story of political hope. And it's, and this is why I really wanted to conclude my book about talking about political hope, because I think there's a cycle of political hope, and there are cycles actually of political hope that take place in Iran. And there's this political hope that resurfaces every time. It is different because, it is, of course, it's mixed with other feelings, and the feeling of, frustration and as you mentioned, this tendency of asking, activists to narrow down, and then becoming the victim of that same, vicious political logic is very true. So it's a political hope every time there's a new presidential election, but it's definitely combined with so many other possibly negative, feelings. But I think there are cycles, and I think it's even right now, it's incredible because the kind of desperation of frustration that I see when I feel when I talk to friends in or family members in Italy is very different from the kind of feeling I hear from my friends in Iran, although they're possibly they're in a much worse situation. So I think it's complicated, but I think there is something about resurfacing hope. And I don't want to sound too optimistic or naive, but But I think there is something about resurfacing political hope that kind of interwaves in the history, contemporary history of Iran.
Mm. Well, picking up on that, the ways in which the I would love to sort of, I know this isn't in your book, but to be thinking about everything you wrote about, and in the context of the Trump's maximum pressure campaigns on Iran and the political and social dynamics within the country today, and sort of these cycles that you're talking about. So there is this, on the one hand, deep despair and deep disappointment at all levels of those within the elite in the country, as well as among them with each other. There is, I've been noticing quite a large, or an uptick of leftism and leftist activists in student university spaces in Iran, which is, I think, really interesting, and has been going on for a little while, but it's manifesting itself in different ways. And then and at the heart of reformism, and you talk about this a little bit in your book, was a belief in a certain kind of liberalism. And much of that kind of liberalism has come under critique, not just within Iran, but on a global scale. And it seems like we're in this moment in which we're trying to grasp, and again, on an international scale, we're trying to grasp for what are other models and other ways of thinking about and doing things. And under the past 4 years that Iran has gone through, there has been this, huge amount of pressure on the country, and then the state transferring that pressure onto the population and securitizing across spheres that you were doing your research in. And so I would love to know your thoughts about, what under these circumstances, and especially looking forward, those types of lessons learned from the reformist period among these younger generations and activists. How do you see this manifesting itself in this current situation in which there's a lot of securitization and also a lot of anxiety, some of which I think is warranted and others not, about a feeling of existential threat against the country? And obviously some of it is utilized to further justify forms of repression. But how do you sort of see what you studied play out, and or potential futures of it?
This is a very important question. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that one of the biggest problems of activism in Iran is actually the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and experience. And that is because it's very dangerous. So it often happens that you have generations, or not entire generations of activists, but good parts of generations of activists who had to leave the country, so they live in exile, or are had been imprisoned, or even worse. So there is an objective problem with that, with passing on information and experience, and actually one of the most urgent needs that friends in Iran, friends who are in different ways politically active, or even just interested in politics and reflect on that, manifest to me, is exactly the need of finding a way to pass on this knowledge. So we often discuss about, websites, and there are already experiences and groups that do this kind of work. This is a bit reinventing the wheel, but this is a testimony to the fact that there is an objective problem with intergenerational transferring of knowledge. So coming to your question, I think that in this sense, there is little that is passing on, or there is, or better to say, it's very difficult for kind of older activists to own the narrative and the rhetoric on about what happened, what they went through, so that they can pass the content they want to pass to the younger generation. The only political space where this can be, is being done, I think quite successfully, is within different types of feminist circles. I'm not saying that different types of feminists talk to each other. This doesn't happen much, but there are many different feminist spaces where actually within those the communication, I think, works more efficiently. So I think I agree. My feeling. I haven't been in Iran, for a couple of years now. So I'm not really. I can't say I'm super updated, but I think my feeling is that there is a fundamental change taking place, and that's a change in terms of ideology of reference. So left ideologies have regained terrain, as you said, but it is also a change in where, I mean, the spaces where activism should take place, and also thinking about structure. I think social media, I mean, you're the expert on this, but my feeling is that social media have really changed the way in which we think of activism from a structural and organizational point of view. So you would have, I remember activists, complaining about the fact that younger activists were so quick in, endorsing campaign and doing things without actually think about what they were doing, what kind of people they were associating themselves with. And I think much of this is happening because of the kind of immediate nature of social media. There are, I mean, today it seems that political work has become something very different from before. It's so easy to call on people to come to take to the streets and organize a protest. And so this has become quite easy. What has become more difficult is the kind of continuous and tedious and boring, political work and political organizing that is behind it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think it's definitely spaces have become tighter and tighter. Maximum pressure, of course, has a huge responsibility for this. Anxiety about the Islamic State also have tightened up and closed down spaces of participation. So summing up, I think more is due to take place and to come. COVID will definitely also have long-term implications. We can't see today, though, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Paula. I love your insistence on this like cyclical nature of these things. It gives me a lot of hope in these dark times, and on a global scale, no matter where it is that we're looking. I really want to thank you for your time. Again, I really enjoyed reading your book, and I love
so much. This really makes me so happy.
Yeah, no, it was so wonderful. And I encourage everyone to look at it. If you are an educator and work on Iran, it's a wonderful book to put on your syllabus. And thank you for your time, Paula. It was so nice to talk to you. I only wish we could actually be hosting you here, but it's lovely to see you again and to be talking to you about all of this, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you very much. And I guess thanks everyone, and best of luck to everybody.